All right, strap in, everyone. Today, we're taking on a case that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the disappearance of Natalee Holloway, back in 2005. It's a story that gripped the world, and we're going to try to untangle it. We've got a ton of material to work with here: court documents, news reports, even excerpts from Beth Holloway's book.
Oh, wow. That's quite the collection.
It is, and we really want to go beyond just the headlines with this one, understand what happened, but also why this case still resonates so strongly. Almost 2 decades later, it's wild.
You're right, it is. It's one of those cases that just stays with you. There's so much mystery, so many unanswered questions, even after all the attention it got.
Exactly. It all starts with what seems like a pretty typical graduation trip. Aruba, sun, beaches, you're 18, celebrating with your friends, freedom, but then it takes this really dark turn.
Yeah, it's almost like the setup for a thriller movie or something.
Yeah,
That contrast, the carefree atmosphere, and then bam, tragedy.
it's chilling. So last night of the trip, Natalee is seen leaving a nightclub with three guys, Joran Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers, Deepak and Satish. And right from the get-go, their stories about what happened that night, they just don't line up.
Conflicting accounts.
Uh,
Yeah, that's a huge red flag for investigators, almost always a sign that something is being hidden.
Okay, so next morning, Natalee doesn't show up for her flight home. Obviously, panic sets in. Her mother, Beth Holloway, she flies down to Aruba immediately and starts this massive search. Volunteers, local authorities, the FBI, you even have Dutch police involved because of Aruba's connection to the Netherlands. It becomes this huge international thing.
I can't imagine the pressure on Aruba. This tiny island suddenly thrust into the global spotlight. The U.S. media, everyone demanding answers, must have been overwhelming.
For sure. So Vandersloot and the Kalpoe brothers, they are arrested pretty quickly, right?
They are, but they're released not long after. Lack of evidence. And this is where things get, well, frustrating, I guess.
Because even with all the public outcry, the legal system has its own rules, right?
Exactly. It's all about evidence, concrete proof. And at that point, there just wasn't enough to hold them.
And then a few years later, we get this bombshell. Joran Vandersloot, he makes this secretly recorded confession in 2008, admits that Natalee died. An accident, he claims. And that he disposed of her body. Talk about a twist.
Huge development.
Yeah.
But also incredibly frustrating. Because, of course, he later recants this confession. And he does this flip-flopping a few times. Different stories. It's almost impossible to know what's true, what's a lie.
So even with this filmed confession, the case is officially closed in 2007. They do reopen it briefly in 2008 after the confession, but nothing concrete comes from it.
And that's the thing about cases like this. Without a body, without that definitive physical evidence, it's incredibly hard to build a strong enough case for prosecution. You're left with a lot of suspicion, a lot of circumstantial stuff, but not that smoking gun.
It's got to be just heartbreaking for Natalee's family. And then, 5 years to the day after Natalee disappears, Joran Vandersloot is involved in another crime. This time, a murder in Peru.
Stephanie Flores. And it just sends chills down your spine, doesn't it?
Mhm.
Makes you wonder, was this a pattern? Did the lack of consequences, the lack of closure in Natalee's case embolden him somehow? It's disturbing.
It really is. And then it gets even crazier. Vandersloot tries to extort money from Beth Holloway, offers her information about Natalee's remains for $250,000. It's like preying on a mother's grief in the worst possible way.
It's despicable. And a classic case of extortion, using that threat, that promise of information to get money.
So he's later indicted in the U.S. on these extortion charges, another layer to this whole saga.
And remember, he's already in prison in Peru for the murder of Stephanie Flores. So now there's this question of extradition. Could he be brought to the U.S. to face these charges?
So we have an officially open but cold case in Aruba, a convicted murderer in Peru, and the potential for extradition hanging over everything. Where do we even begin to untangle all of this?
Well, that's what we're going to do, right? Break down the facts, look at the different angles,
Mhm.
try to make some sense of it all.
Exactly, and we're going deep. We'll be looking at the impact on Aruba, not just vaguely. We have actual figures on how their tourism industry was hit.
And we'll get into the specifics of how they changed their law enforcement protocols. Because Aruba, they did a lot to show the world they were taking this seriously.
Right, they wanted to improve their whole investigative process. And of course, we can't forget Beth Holloway, her tireless fight for answers, and the Natalee Holloway Resource Center, which she founded to help other families in these just unimaginable situations.
It's an amazing thing, turning such a personal tragedy into something that helps others. It speaks volumes about her strength and determination.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've laid some groundwork, but trust me, there's so much more to uncover. Let's move on to some of the key developments in the investigation. All the twists and turns that have kept this case in the public eye for so long.
So those early investigations, I mean, they were really under a microscope, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. You've got the conflicting stories from those guys, Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers. The media scrutiny was insane. And then you factor in the whole different legal system in Aruba. It was bound to be messy.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that chaos led to some missteps early on. The way some of the evidence was handled, for example.
Right. There were questions about whether the crime scene was properly secured, right? And those search dogs, if they were really reliable, I mean, every little thing gets scrutinized in a case like this.
Exactly. And when things don't add up, that's when people start grasping for explanations. Conspiracy theories start to pop up.
Like mushrooms after a rain.
Right. And we touched on this before, but it's worth digging a little deeper. We're talking about theories ranging from human trafficking to police corruption. Even Joran's father, him being a judge in Aruba at the time, that fueled some speculation.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I get it. When there are so many unanswered questions, it's natural for people to try to fill in the blanks.
Absolutely. But it's a slippery slope. These theories can be really compelling, but they can also distract from the actual investigation, send things down the wrong path.
Which brings us to the advancements in forensic technology. That's something that always fascinates me about cold cases. The idea that new science might be able to unlock old secrets.
It's incredible, right? We're talking about things that weren't even possible back in 2005.
So what specifically are we talking about here? What kind of things could be re-examined in Natalee's case?
Well, DNA analysis has come a long way. We can get usable DNA from tiny samples now, a few skin cells, a strand of hair. Even a droplet of sweat can be enough.
Wow. So even if they don't find Natalee's remains, there's a chance they could find her DNA somewhere. And that could link back to someone involved.
Exactly. And then there's ground-penetrating radar. It's pretty amazing. It lets investigators scan underground without digging everything up.
Like an X-ray for the ground. So they could use that to search areas that were already searched, maybe find something that was missed the first time.
That's the idea. And sonar technology, too, which is used underwater. Aruba is an island, so this could be really useful for searching the surrounding waters.
It's mind-blowing, like a whole new set of tools that could potentially crack this case wide open.
It's definitely a possibility. But I think it's important to manage expectations. These technologies are amazing, but they're not foolproof. There's no guarantee they'll lead to a breakthrough.
Of course. But even the possibility is something, especially for families who've been waiting for answers for so long. And speaking of which, I have to say, Beth Holloway, her dedication to finding out what happened to Natalee is just incredible.
She's amazing. She could have easily just retreated into grief. But instead, she chose to fight, not just for Natalee, but for other families going through the same nightmare.
And the Natalee Holloway Resource Center, that's become a lifeline for so many people.
Absolutely. They provide all kinds of support, legal guidance, dealing with the media, even resources for conducting independent searches. And they're actively pushing for better policies, improved investigative techniques.
So it's not just about support, it's about empowering families to be active participants in the search and trying to prevent these tragedies from happening in the first place.
You got it. And they do it all with so much compassion. They understand that every missing person case is unique. Every family has different needs.
It's really inspiring to see so much good coming from such a horrible situation.
It is. Beth Holloway, she turned her pain into something positive. And it shows that even in the darkest times, there's always hope. There's always the potential for change.
Okay, so let's talk about Joran Sloot again. He's in prison in Peru right now, but there's a chance he could be extradited to the U.S. to face those extortion charges. And that adds a whole other layer of complexity to this case.
Yeah, we're talking about international law, different jurisdictions. It gets very complicated.
So what are the chances of this actually happening? And what would it mean for Natalee's case if he were brought to the U.S.?
Well, it's not a simple yes or no answer. There are a lot of moving parts.
Like what? What are the biggest hurdles?
So first off, extradition depends on treaties between countries. Agreements about when they'll hand someone over to another country's legal system.
Right.
Luckily, there is a treaty between the U.S. and Peru that covers this kind of situation. So that's a good start.
Okay, so what else? What are the other factors?
Well, the U.S. would have to make a strong case to Peru. Show them that the extortion charges are serious, worth extraditing him for.
But he's already serving time for murder in Peru, right? Wouldn't they just keep him there?
That's the thing. Peru might see it that way, like he's already being punished. So the U.S. would need to convince them that these extortion charges are significant enough.
I see. So even if the U.S. does everything right, there's no guarantee.
Exactly. And on top of that, Sloot himself could fight extradition. He could hire lawyers, file appeals, try to delay things. It could drag on for years.
Oh, man. More legal battles. It's just more waiting and uncertainty for Natalee's family.
It's tough.
Yeah.
But let's say, hypothetically, he is extradited. What would that mean for Natalee's case? Would it actually help?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, he'd be on U.S. soil, so American investigators could question him directly, maybe get new information, a confession, who knows?
That's the hope. But even then, it's complicated. Would anything he said in the U.S. be admissible in an Aruban court? Because
Okay.
remember, that's where the crime happened.
Right. Different legal system.
Exactly. So it's not a slam dunk. Even if he confesses in the U.S., it might not lead to charges in Aruba.
It's just layer upon layer with this case. So much uncertainty.
It is. But here's the thing. Even if Sloot never sets foot in an Aruban courtroom, the very act of extraditing him, it could have a ripple effect.
How so?
Think about it. It would put this case back in the headlines, renew public pressure, maybe even shake loose some new information. Someone who was afraid to talk before might come forward. You never know.
I guess you're right. It could be a catalyst, even if it's not the direct path to justice everyone hopes for.
Exactly. And, taking a step back, it's important to acknowledge the impact this case has had on, well, everything. How we view missing persons cases, the way international investigations are handled, even the role of the media. It's been a huge learning experience, albeit a tragic one.
Yeah. Natalee's disappearance really exposed some of the weaknesses in the system, the things that could be improved.
Right. Like communication between different countries' law enforcement, the way evidence is handled, the need for clear protocols when someone goes missing abroad.
And those lessons, they've had a real impact, haven't they?
They have. Law enforcement agencies around the world, they've learned from this case. They've updated their procedures, improved training. The whole approach to missing persons cases has evolved.
So even though there are still so many unanswered questions about what happened to Natalee, there is a sense of, I don't know, a legacy, like something positive came out of it.
I think that's a good way to put it. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, we can learn and grow. We can make things better for the future. So, yeah, a bittersweet legacy.
Well said. And, as we wrap up this deep dive, it really strikes me how much we still don't know. And how this case, even after all this time, it still has the power to spark conversations, to raise questions, to make us think.
It does. It's a story about loss, about the search for truth, about the complexities of the justice system, and about the incredible resilience of the human spirit, especially Beth Holloway's unwavering dedication to finding answers.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And to everyone listening, we encourage you to keep exploring this case. There are so many resources out there, documentaries, articles, books. Form your own opinions, because the truth, it's out there somewhere. We may not have all the answers, but the search for them, that's what matters. And hopefully someday, there will be justice for Natalee.